personally my own formation, so it's a kind of recent history of feminist writing. And then hopefully we can discuss the writings after, or the readings after I speak. And depending on time frame, we might break between my two talks. The second talk is quite short. I also want to apologize. Sometimes I'm going to be revisiting things I mentioned yesterday very quickly in passing. I hope it's not too repetitive, but I hope it also fills out the picture. Less so in this first talk, but more so when I discuss sort of recent feminist history, if we get there. Okay, so one of the standard refrains of feminist architectural historians has been, is sound working, image working? Oh, can we clear the screen so we don't see all the stuff? Put it on slideshow?
It's not coming. I'm asking.
Oh, I guess, I mean, that's showing, we don't, maybe after the talk, we can see all the participants, but I'm just afraid of cutting off some of the images. Maybe hide the participants till the discussion. Great, thank you. And we can re-put the people's faces back on later. Okay, so one of the sort of standard refrains of feminist architectural historians has been that women designers before World War II were neglected or not given their due during their lifetimes. In short, that they were victims of discrimination and thus omitted from the canon. And typically the blame for their lack of recognition is placed either on the heroic figures of modern architecture, namely people like Corbu, Mies, etc., for underplaying their contribution, or on the nature of modern architecture itself. Uh-oh, it's not advancing. Let me press harder, yeah. Okay, no? Okay.
Não tá aparecendo nada disso. Não, eu não sei como é que você tira.
Basically, this stereotyped image of modern architecture for underplaying their contribution, that it's white, austere, and geometric, and that it precluded accommodating the aesthetic of practitioners such as Eileen Gray, who rejected the reductive purity of the avant-garde in the interests of comfort, emotion, diversity, and sensuous pleasure. And later, I think it's assigned for, I can't remember, the third or the fourth week, I have a little writing, a dialogue with her and Jean Badavici about just her position. But in other words, standard accounts of modern architecture, like modernism, followed Andreas Husson's paradigm. Modernism was linked with high art, exclusivity, and white men, mass culture with entertainment, decoration, and women. The difficulties with this model, especially for a field that has been all about breaking down boundaries between art and life, have rarely been broached. In other words, I don't know if you've read Hussein's article yet, but the standard accounts really have made modernism a kind of male domain and mass culture female. But this doesn't really work for a discipline like art and for architecture, where it's always had an integration with life. Okay, and although few would dispute the considerable egos of Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, or Frank Lloyd Wright, or more generally the legal and economic inequities that women faced in the interwar years, today I would like to re-examine, in other words, question a little, the question of women designers' secondary status, focusing on European developments before World War II. And the impetus for this talk was simply that scenarios of victimhood did not gel with my own experience talking with Charlotte Perriand, whom I'll come back to again in another talk, and others who had worked in Le Corbusier's atelier. In addition, when I was doing research on the interwar period, women's names kept popping up in European architecture and design journals, especially relative to the numbers of women architects during the era. For example, Perriand's work was widely published in the 1920s and 30s in magazines such as Art et Décoration, Art et Industrie, L'Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, The Studio in England, and even I discovered the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a local newspaper in New York, and she often received lavish praise. But this extensive press coverage extended to other European women designers, even the notoriously shy and self-effacing Eileen Gray, to whom a whole issue of Vendigen, the Dutch magazine in 1924, was dedicated to her work. She also received extensive coverage in L'Architecture Vivante, perhaps not surprisingly, because it was edited by her collaborator and the eventual owner of E1027. There, of course, the famous villa. Other women, too, were not ignored. John Summerson, in Architect and Building News, for instance, singles out Elizabeth Denby's all-European house, an early example of low-rise, high-density housing of 1939. And again, I'll come back to this. We often think of low-rise, high-density housing as being something of the 70s, late 60s, 70s, even early 80s. But there's this wonderful model already in Britain in the late 30s. He called it, which was displayed at the Daily Mail's Ideal Home Exhibition, breakaway, I'm quoting, in its sensitivity to the worker's point of view. Indeed, Gertrude Lahotsky, Elizabeth Scott, the designer of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, and Helena Sirkis, as well as a series of remarkable Swedish, Israeli, and English, there again is coverage of English woman, Elizabeth Benjamin, all received ample coverage in the press, if not always outside their national boundaries. In other words, I'm trying to argue, and it's very obvious, that this critique of victimhood is a bit problematic, given that these women really were recognized in their period. I'm not saying they didn't face discrimination, but they were not neglected. So it raises bigger questions that I'll return to of why did they become neglected. Nor are they treated necessarily with the begrudging width that we all know so well. What is especially striking about the criticism of the period is how often it allies modern architecture with the invention and creativity of these pioneering women. For example, Marcel Valotaire writes on seeing Perrion's 1928 dining room, "Never before have I so definitively the feeling of entering a new world, the feel of breaking with narrow traditions, of a window open to the future." And he goes on saying how it raises grave social questions about home life, housing, the problem of women, that have all resulted from our old customs. So the question then, why this assumption of women's neglect? Or their actual omission, as I discussed yesterday, in most of the histories of modern architecture written after 1950. And this includes books I didn't discuss yesterday: Bruno Zevi, Leonardo Benevolo, Jürgen Jodecki, but also Raymond Urbanum, whom I mentioned, Charles Jenks, Manfredo de Forian, Francesco Delco, William Curtis, etc. In fairness, some of these authors mentioned that one or two women's designers in their accounts of pre-war architecture, but always very quickly in passing. Better? Okay. Often misspelling their names. I'm always curious about that, but they get spelled all sorts of ways. All omit Ino Elto's name, even when the Elto's World's Fairs pavilions are discussed at length. Before considering why, and by the way, the World's Fair pavilions were presented at the time in both their names, and in fact, Ino and Elvar often entered separate entries for these competitions. So why they would celebrate these designs and never mention her is kind of a mystery to me. So before considering why, and I will hopefully do that with some of your help, I would like to look at several early books on modern architecture. And here the story is more complicated. Is the sound working now? Okay. As one might expect, in most surveys written before 1930, women are virtually invisible. For example, Adolf Benne's Die moderne Zeckbau, or the modern functional building of 26, Walter Kurt Behrens, I'm going to just say the English titles instead of creaming the German, The Victory of the New Building Style, 1927, Henry Russell Hitchcock's Modern Architecture, Romanticism, and Reintegration, and Bruno Taut's Modern Architecture. Even though as early as 1924, Bruno Taut's Die Neue Wohnung, whose subtitle was the title in English, The New Dwelling, Woman as Creator, was a call for arms of sorts for women to assert control over their environment, even publishing a German version of Christine Frederick's diagram that I mentioned yesterday. However, if one turns instead to books written a bit later, such as Howard Robertson's Modern Architecture Design and Alberto Sartori's Gli elementi dell'architettura funzionale, both published in 1932, or those that focus more specifically on residential architecture, women have a much stronger presence. For example, Carl Taiga's The Minimal Dwelling of 1932, or the Italian journalist Lydia Morelli's The House That I Would Like to Have, 1931, two books that have radically different ideological affinities. And you see again that Christine Frederick diagram in Lydia Morelli, really underscoring how important this American domestic reform movement became in Europe. Even given the time constraints, I I would like to focus, this is a page from Lydia Morelli. I would like to focus now on two surveys of the interwar period that specifically address the issue of women designers as women. And I suspect, I don't know if they'll be familiar to you, but they certainly weren't familiar to me till I encountered them in my own research. The first book, published in 1928, is not specifically about architecture, but rather is a brief history of women's art across time. Titled The Woman as Artist, it was written by art historian Hans Hildebrand, who is most remembered today for being the German translator of Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture. The German edition came out in '26. It's also important to note, I think, that Hildebrand was the husband of Lily Hildebrand, née Ullmann, a painter, journalist, and active supporter of the Bauhaus. And believe it or not, as a married woman and with Hans Hildebrand's full knowledge, had a passionate affair with Walter Gropius for 4 years following the separatist uprising. She was later called a degenerate artist in the Nazi regime. Although Hans Hildebrand, in this book here, only devotes a few pages to architecture in a survey of women's art, what he says, I think, is remarkably revealing about both the status of women in architecture in the 1920s and those qualities of their work that were most recognized at the time. He begins his account with the declaration that women architects, using the German term building artist in Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, are still a rare exception. There weren't a lot of them. He gives 3 possible causes, and I think it's, again, interesting to think how long these causes might have persisted. First, the fact that it hasn't been long since women were allowed to study architecture. Second, that some women may still not trust their abilities and think about it as the period of the 20s. And third, that others may not have recognized their talents in architecture, such as Marlene Polzik, whom I mentioned yesterday, until after first working in other fields. In other words, that women came to architecture often late, first working as artists, sculptors, decorative artists, and get to architecture a bit later. And it even happened after the war. Think of someone like Gaia Lonti, who designed the layout of Casa Bella and then got known for her project at Gare d'Orsay. Far from seeing women's contributions, and these are pages from Hildebrand, to architecture as decorative or ornamental, Hildebrand stresses their pragmatic or functional nature, alluding to arrangement, distribution, furnishing, and equipment. He acknowledges that none of the new women designers had the bold, I'm quoting him, gestures of a leader, but he also makes it clear that he does not see that as their goal, or maybe even as the correct goal. Instead, the apartment houses of the Viennese Ella Briggs or Gret Schut-Lahotsky were built, he says, in the modern spirit. And I'm quoting him, "They were well balanced in proportions, in volumetric relations, and integrated organically into the landscape. To ask for more," he asserts, "would be unjust." Indeed, his tone implies a preference for their modesty, which he sees as inherent in the new approach, in other words, to modern architecture. However, it is in the organization and furnishing of the domestic interior that he gives women designers most credit. Knowing, he writes, the thousands of open secret desires of women and duties that are required and that must be made easier. He writes about women designers. They have produced, he asserts, exemplary solutions for small households and children's rooms. He mentions the, quote, practical and charming room arrangements of Alma Buscher-Seedhoff at the Bauhaus, citing specifically, she designed the kitchen in the first big exhibition of the Bauhaus, the model House on Horn, still in Weimar, with these continuous countertops, built-in cabinets, etc., which was still very unusual at the time. And he is especially taken with her ingenious toy cabinet that comes apart. You see it there. The historian, by the way, Nicholas Pevsner, bought it when it later was on auction for his own children. And he also praises an image you're going to keep seeing again and again, I fear, Gertrude Lohotsky's Frankfurt kitchen, for which he says made life easier. What a blessing was Gertrude Lohotsky's Frankfurt kitchen for hundreds and hundreds of families, he writes. This is an example of how the woman architect beat out her male competitors in a modest but infinitely important area of expertise. Hildebrandt lavishes even greater praise on the household reformer, Erna Meyer. I'll go back, I don't have an image here, but you saw one yesterday, and the designer Lily Reich. And he lavishes, just a moment. I guess I don't have one for her either, sorry about that. Which he praises, you'll see images of Reich later. That he says, suggestions that are completely, this is still about Gertrude Lohotsky, that she brought a total reform in housekeeping, nothing to do with art. But he talks about Lily Reich only could have been conceived by a woman who was able to create something, and I think this is an interesting phrase, from the brittle material of everyday life that resembles the meaningful harmony of an artwork. In other words, these women designers are actually breaking down the boundaries between everyday life and high art, and shouldn't be seen in those terms of modernism that I mentioned Husson described at the beginning. He writes about this transformation of mundane quotidian reality as the grounds by which we should celebrate Reich, and does so, I might add, without any reference to her collaborator and romantic partner, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And I think this passage is worth quoting in full, so forgive me for the long quotation. The organizational work of Lily Reich is taking place quasi-anonymously. Who could ask? So these women are still not totally recognized, but they're recognized by these early historians. Who could ask for more in an exhibition in which everything is distributed in a well-arranged and charming manner, in rooms that have transformed beyond recognition in a minimal means? Whom do we have to thank for this joy? Or while shopping for underwear, who would have known that it was possible for someone to unite so convincingly the rational and healthy with the purely beautiful? In this way, it is possible to accomplish important cultural work, creative without seeking attention. Here, Hildebrandt stresses again 3 points. If he had 3 causes why women weren't so well known, he now has 3 points about women designers. That women's architectural work is 1, rational and based on clear organization. 2, that it creates a new kind of beauty out of quotidian situations with minimal means. And third, and I'm quoting, the modern spirit, his words, is not an issue of bold plastic gestures, but rather lies in the solution of real problems in creative ways. If he is guilty of a certain degree of essentialism, or at least of accepting the prevailing norm that women remain in charge of households, he also seems to be giving new value and importance to the domestic realm and women's role in shaping it. I also just want to mention that he cites a lot of women names such as Ella Briggs, Marlene Polsek, Alma Busher, Sophie Harper Tautberg, that I hadn't referred to. He refers to her as the sole designer of the Café Konditorei, or at the Café de l'Aubette in Strasbourg, usually attributed to Van Doesburg. And he gives these women presents, and I think we could go back to these books of thinking which of these women need further studies and investigation. But next I want to return to a second book, and there you see images of Harper Taut, Ella Briggs, some of the women that have not been given full credit in my mind. Okay, this second book that I want to turn to was written a few years later by a German architect, not an art historian, and one of the leading chroniclers of modern architecture, Gustav Adolf Platz. He writes a book called Living Spaces in the Present, published in 1933, the same year Hitler came to power. Platz saw this book as a kind of companion volume to his earlier 1927 survey of contemporary architecture, architecture of our time. It's a great book, by the way, unfortunately never translated except in German, but gives you a wonderful array, that first book of 27, of contemporary architecture. And in that book, women do not appear, at least until the revised edition. In the second edition, he had some women. But in this second book of 33, they appear, and prominently. In fact, besides Lily Reich, Schütte-Lohotzky, Perriand, and Erna Meyer, we get a series of new names that have been virtually forgotten. Charlotte X, Adrian Gorska, the sister of the painter Tamara de Lempinka, and the woman who, by the way, taught Eileen Gray architectural drawing as she moved from lacquer work and screens to architecture. Marlene Polsek, whom I mentioned, there again is her own house, and someone called Ruth Hildegard Geyer-Reck, whom I still know very little about. The latter he thanks, along with Perriand, whom he shows in her chair designs, along with other women, for helping with the preparation of his book. Notice the chaise longue in the center column. This list of less familiar names include men as well, even several Japanese designers, such as Horiguchi. And I want to stress, again, there's this stereotype that modern architecture is purely Western European, Northern American later. There's much more diversity in some of these interwar accounts than people tend to recognize unless they really go back to primary sources. Platz is a strong advocate of the new architecture, but like another writer of the period, the British man, Howard Robertson, he presents himself as a kind of middle-of-the-road modernist, not a radical avant-gardist. Here are two examples of his interior design and furniture. Well, careful exercises in functionalism, His designs lack the radical aplomb of architects like Le Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe. He had worked with people like Franz Schumacher in Hamburg before the war, and was the head of architectural department in Mannheim, a position he held to 32. And in general, I think his writings reflect this pragmatic, tempered kind of modernism. In his book, a page, he develops in much greater length, in greater detail, many of the themes that Hildebrandt had introduced. The importance of housing and the domestic interior to modern architecture, the need for rational organization or scientific management of the home, and the particular skills and sensitivities that women bring to this realm. Like Hildebrandt, he challenges the traditional dichotomy between high art and everyday life, and with full consciousness of the gender connotations of this distinction. However, he goes much further than his predecessor, criticizing the basic educational system of architects. And I think this is one reason for any feminist history, and I'm very encouraged to hear this is happening in Brazil, that we really look at early histories of architectural education. And this is what he writes, Plotz writes. For the last century, the architect considered himself to be an artist. He thought dealing with the particular problems of the household were irrelevant, since he had not learned about their importance in school. As I mentioned yesterday, in the Beaux-Arts education, housing the interior residence was basically not a subject to be taught. And the same was true in the German Polytechnic. But Plotz argues, however, the architecture student should have started his education with designing houses, and in particular with the hearth, the center of the house and community space of the family, just as his ancestors had. It is hard to imagine how many sins have been committed against the health and well-being of the common woman and household help just by the wrong layout of the kitchen. Today we realize that our own women who cannot afford servants anymore will suffer the same fate of premature decline. Finally, this has to do with my title, the architect has started to learn from the housewife. In other words, women have something to bring and teach the field. I told you I was obsessed with kitchens and bathrooms, and here we have another example, again, of Gretchen Lohotsky. One of the arguments he makes is one of the lessons the architect has started to learn was the importance of domestic service rooms, kitchens, laundry rooms, and bathrooms. And by the way, there's a lot more research to be done on laundry, which was a major, major chore in this interwar period before automatic washing machines and certainly before dryers. They are, Plotz argues, no longer secondary spaces, unworthy of the architect's attention. Following Taub, he devotes a whole chapter to this subject and includes among his plates a large selection of these rooms. Placing Lily Reich's kitchen at the Berlin 1931 exhibition on the page across from Le Corbusier's iconic image of the kitchen in Villa Savoie, by the way, designed by Perriand. He describes at length the numerous, quote, practical contribution of Erna Meyer, and repeats her assertion that women must save their energy, and I quote, for higher tasks that go beyond domestic economy. In other words, we don't just have efficient kitchens without all these tchotchkes floating around for the sake of better housework, but we have them so women can get on to do with other tasks, whether it's working, participating in the public sphere, or even being better creative mothers with their children. Along these lines, he also spends considerable time discussing the woman's bedroom. At this point, often in middle-class households, women had separate rooms. A room that he believes women should be able to shape, he writes, according to their own needs, comparing it to a dress, a place for self-expression, and really feels the need for women's own space. Exactly the kind of argument, if done for other reasons, that Virginia Woolf makes almost in the same time period, a little earlier, a room of one's own. These reforms are not simply tied to improving women's lot at home, but closely tied for plots, as I said, to changes in social mores and the economic situation after World War I. Women may need and want to work, and the house needs to accommodate that shift in condition. He recognizes that increasing numbers of single women have joined the workforce and applauds, once more, the careful layout of Gertrude Lukotsky's designs, now not just for the kitchen, but for working women, a project he also published in the revised edition of his first book. So Gertrude Lukotsky, and this is also published in Carl Taiga's book, The Minimum Dwelling, not just designed kitchens. She later complains that's all she's known for. But she designed projects for single women, working women, that she helped would allow their own household management to be easier so they had time to join the workforce. Most important, and this is probably Plot's most original point, he sees architecture as a field women should embrace. Whether trained as designers or not, women, he argues, should take a leading role in design. Just as architects must learn from women, women too must assert their opinions and actively engage, he argues, in home consultation, whether as amateurs using standardized components and design handbooks such as Erna Meyer's, or as professionals assisting others in the design or furnishings of their homes. And he also celebrates this as a rewarding task for women, especially as larger construction opportunities have been curtailed. And remember, the book is published in 1933 at the height of the worldwide depression. This focus on habitation in both Hildebrandt and Platz's texts raises questions about whether their discussion of women and the domestic realm only reinforce traditional stereotypes relegating women to the home. Hildebrandt admittedly expresses a hesitation about how realistic it is for women to undertake larger commissions at this moment in time, although, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Scott, when she was only the age of 20, had won the competition for the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in 1929. But the attention, by the way, competitions were a great way for women to enter into architecture because they were judged anonymously and no one knew they were women. And this still was the case for my generation of women, like Zaha Hadid winning the Hong Kong Peaks competition was how she entered the field. But the attention, going back to the domestic sphere, but the attention and seriousness which Plotz and Hildebrandt give, as did other early commentators on modern architecture, as well as modern architects themselves, give to housing and interior arrangements I think belies any easy generalizations about the secondary status of this concern or women's position in architecture. In fact, Hildebrandt's and Platz's arguments would seem to assert the reverse, that women's leadership in domestic reform had made male architects more aware of this fundamental dimension of architecture and of the limitations of traditional professional education and the notions of architecture as style or pure form. Service spaces were now as important as spaces of display, the domestic interior as significant as the public building exterior. Nor were rationality, technology, and efficiency seen as exclusively male attributes, something I mentioned yesterday. These books, like Women's Design Practice of these early women designers, can be seen, I think, as challenging, once more, long-standing hierarchies of public-private, art and daily life, as well as traditional conventions about gender imagery and women's roles. But now I want to return briefly, and I really would like your help in these speculations, why women's subsequent exclusion or near exclusion from architectural histories written during and after World War II, until, as I showed recently, the last decade or so. And the reasons, I think, are undoubtedly complex and multiple, but I'm going to propose a few, and I hope you'll propose some more in the discussion. First, it seems that conventionally trained art historians, and Gideon himself, despite starting out studying mechanical engineering, might be seen as representative of this. He studied with Heinrich Wöfflin in Germany, had difficulties dispensing with the old hierarchies, even as they embraced the new architecture. Space, time, and architecture began essentially as a celebration of two giants of the modern movement. And if you read the first edition, it's almost completely about Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius, with Mies van der Rohe and Alvar Aalto gaining prominence only in subsequent editions. But it's again heroic figures. The anonymity that Hildebrandt refers to barely meshes with his models of great men as creators, which underplays the role of collaboration and teamwork. This focus on artistic genius was, of course, reversed, as I alluded to yesterday, in Gideon's marvelous book, Following the War, Mechanization Takes Command, a contribution, notice the subtitle, to Anonymous History, written in 1948, where women play a prominent role. Needless to say, this was not the text assigned to thousands of architecture students. I think you almost had to be a PhD student to get to read Mechanization Takes Command, even though it's an absolutely marvelous book. Another factor I would propose that might have worked against women's inclusion in the historical canon was translation, which undoubtedly limited familiarity with German developments, where women played an early role. And of course, the same happens with early Brazilian modern architecture, where translation was an issue. Neither Hildebrandt's or Platz's books were translated into English or French or Italian, nor were Erna Meyer's or Gertrude Lohotsky's own writings. Here, political events might have been determinant. In fact, the same events that so deeply affected the careers of these pioneering women. Meyer emigrated to Israel after Hitler came to power. She was Jewish. Gertrude Lohotsky who was not Jewish, but a political radical, emigrated to the USSR in Turkey. And people don't often recognize that the first people in concentration camps in Germany were not necessarily Jews, but political leftists, already entering concentration camps, not being killed, but confined for their politics in late '33. And of course, Gretchen Lahotsky was imprisoned when she returned to Austria to fight Hitler, and then had a very marginal career, mostly in East Germany, because of her leftist politics. Reich remained in Germany, but with very limited work. A third factor I should have shown that earlier, but it represents my point, I think, is the Museum of Modern Art, which played such a prominent role in defining and disseminating modern architecture in the US. But before I mention more about MoMA, there you see an early image of it. I want to mention something else about translation. Why was German books translated? Not only the fact that these women emigrated, but Germany was a language almost verboten, or not allowed in England and in the US because of Hitler and fighting World War II. So even though I had a German background mother who tried desperately to teach me German, growing up in the 50s, you could not learn German in the US. German departments were closed down, even though it was a language of science. And so there's a reason, I think, that these very progressive early German women were left out weren't translated, and these books were not translated. As I said, a third factor, and it may seem I'm giving too much prominence to a New York institution, you could challenge me on that, but I think it had a huge role in the dissemination of modern architecture, is the Museum of Modern Art. I think, at least in the US, it really defined and disseminated modern architecture, modern aesthetic, and made it acceptable a bit later than in Europe, really not till the 30s. Just a sec. I'm having allergy problems. The only project by a woman in Hitchcock and Johnson's book, The International Style, was A Woman's Bedroom by Lily Reich. And the photographic caption couldn't have been more telling. Luxurious and feminine character. So even though Johnson thought she was a great designer, she was definitely relegated to a kind of woman's category. With their emphasis on style, and Hitchcock and Johnson basically ignored all the issues I've just been talking about: household rationalization and service spaces. Modern architecture for them was a style. Smooth lines, simple, flat roofs, no decoration. It had nothing to do with changing functional interior relations, basically. Undoubtedly, though, and in fact, MoMA's prejudice, I think, carries over Johnson's very strong role in curating and controlling who's hired after him for the next 30 years or so. MoMA's curators were not careful about citing women. In the 1937 exhibition on English modern architecture, for instance, two names of women designers that I've just mentioned, Elizabeth Denby and Elizabeth Benjamin, were left off the credit lines, generating a series of increasingly angry complaints from both the women and their male partners. I had so much fun when I was doing research for an article for a MoMA book, when I discovered these letters, just livid at MoMA for leaving off their names. And in fact, it ruined the relationship between Maxwell Fry and Elizabeth Denby because she blamed him for not giving her enough credit to MoMA. And undoubtedly more is at play here than a high art bias. May I mention the deeply male, even possibly misogynist culture of the institution itself. And I think it's not an accident that the wonderful feminist political collective, Guerrilla Girls, attacked MoMA as one of their very first institutional operations. With this, they would do all these great propagandistic art, campaigning against MoMA, the Met, etc. in New York. Their identity was completely hidden. They wore masks, these guerrilla masks. They still exist, although not quite so active. Harder to pinpoint, but probably just as important, was the changing nature of modern architecture itself after World War II. Even as increasing number of women received professional degrees and residential interiors were equipped with modern, efficient kitchens and the latest appliances, modern architecture seemed to become increasingly male. And I don't mean that in an essentialist sense, but how it got recognized at the time. On the one hand, it was associated in the 1950s and 60s with corporate culture. The high-rise office buildings of SOM and Mies van der Rohe, even when they were designed partly by a woman like Natalie Dublois. On the other hand, with the gestural public buildings of the late Le Corbusier, Saarinen, and Utzon, in short, post-war modern architecture evoked businessmen or artistic genius. In this context, I think it's easy to overlook the modest, to use Hildebrandt's words, but infinitely important contributions of figures like Lily Reich or Schutt Lohotzky. By 1960, and the publication of Banham's Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, these early women were virtually forgotten. Books such as Hildebrandt's and Platz's remind us, I think, once again, of the seminal role that women designers had in helping create a radical new vision of living, one that was so fundamental to the very nature, I would say, of modern architecture itself. So that's talk number one. And I would love to hear your reactions and alternative ideas about what you think the cause of this neglect is. Thanks. Should we take a break or why don't we take a 15-minute break and then some questions, and then I might or might not, depending on the time. I've got another kind of brief history of radical feminism in the first books, and we can also discuss reading.